Alright, so getting stuck straight in here, the people who signed up would have received a layout sketch showing them how I've laid out my scene. I'm just working on a cotton watercolor block here. This paper will allow me to not only have the paper not buckle too much, but more to the point, it's going to stay flat for a lot longer. If you're dealing with a watercolor paper, it's really crucial that you get a paper that is a cotton base, as the wood pulp papers will actually soak up that moisture and it doesn't let it go. So when it does dry out, you'll find that the pulp grains will actually create bubbles and ripples across your paper, which isn't very nice. Brush wise, I'm working with a soft varnish brush is what I start with. This is a 1-inch soft varnish brush from Art Spectrum. I find this is my ideal brush for a lot of my big stuff. When you're dealing with watercolor, the crucial part that you need to take into account is you don't want to be working too small for the majority of your work. The bigger the brush, the bolder you can make your marks and the looser you can be with your paint work. From there, I go across to a number 10 round brush. This is a Taklon. It's just a J Burrows I've picked up at Officeworks. I've actually found they've been really good and lay down the paint quite nicely. Finally, I just work with a little long head liner for my final detail works and signatures. Keeps it really simple. 3 brushes to do nearly the whole job, and with a scene like this where we're dealing on a small piece of paper, I'm just working on an A4 watercolor block, so it's nice and compact. I can get a lot down pretty quickly. We'll look at the palette now. So in my palette, I keep to my primaries for nearly everything I do. I do have a couple of additions in my watercolor range, but the majority of this is based on how I work in nearly every other medium. So to start off with, we have lemon yellow, cadmium yellow deep, cadmium red, crimson. Depending on the medium, I will either work with crimson or I will work with magenta. I have dioxazine violet over in my corner, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, and to finish off, I just keep a little bit of burnt sienna and burnt umber on my palette as well for some darks. And that sees me right for my watercolor range. That same mix is pretty much what I work with the exception of the burnt sienna and the violet when it comes to working in acrylic as well. So my pencil sketch has been kept very simple. I've just got very basic outlines to show me where things are going. It doesn't have to be really complex. A lot of people when they start out think they have to put everything in. You do not. Keep it as simple as possible, and remember, this is an impression of what you are seeing in your reference in the scene that you are viewing. It's something that takes a long time to get your head around when you are starting out. We all think that we have to paint every single detail. Detail is not the key. Suggesting the detail is where the magic happens, and that's where you find a lot of the great painters really excel. You've got hyperrealists and photorealists where they'll paint literally every detail they see. But then you'll find there's a lot that sit between there to the very abstract impressionist range, where they'll take a scene like this, but they'll only put in what they really feel is necessary. So I've just got a big bucket of water here. We're going to get ourselves started. I'm going to start with my sky. If you're working in watercolor, a great way to start off is getting there and breaking your piece into a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. So what I mean by that is making sure that the areas that you wet are not being affected by the next area you work into. So what I like to do, I always start in any scene I do with my background. Furthest subject to closest subject. So we're just going to get there and load up our brush here. So you can see it's quite wet. And we're going to pre-wet our sky area. I am not going to wet the entire sky area. I actually want to leave a couple of little points. I want to have a little bit of cloud floating through here. So I've got this little dry section on the paper here. Always handy to have a little bit of paper towel on hand as well if you're working in watercolor. You can use that to dab out areas if you really need to, but more to the point to control how the paint sits on the paper. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to take the same big brush and I'm just going to get some ultramarine and phthalo on the go here. So I'm taking my two blues to mix up a middle base blue. From the very top of the paper, keeping the brush nice and flat, we're just going to run it across. Taking the excess paint out of the brush at this point because I just need to drag this colour down now. Now the majority of the paint colours that I'm working with here you are going to find in most basic watercolour sets. The difference between the more expensive sets and the cheaper sets is going to be the amount of pigment that is in that tube. So it's getting this nice little cloud floating over here. Just taking that brush back through very gently, just to even the coverage. To make this a little bit more interesting, I'm just going to take the tiniest amount of my crimson and I'm going to work that along my horizon. Taking the brush on its side. Big brushes are great because you can still get there and get quite a lot of detail out of them if you use them the right way. Just want to get that slight mauve flowing across the horizon there. Now what we're going to do, we've got our blues on the go. When you have a look at the shadows coming in on the other side, there's a lot of blue in that, but what we're going to focus on first is the beach. So I'm just going to wipe out the little bit of paint that I've got on the palette here. This is why we always keep the paper towel on hand. Try and keep your working area on your palette clean as much as possible. Now for the sand, what I would really like some feedback here. What colours are you all seeing in there? How would you make that colour if you had to without my guidance? Curious as to how people read these areas. For me, I'm actually going to start with some lemon yellow. Lemon yellow is quite clean, but it does have a slight green undertone to it. And into that, I am going to pick up a tiny touch of the crimson. So this is where colour bias in colour becomes really handy. It's something that a lot of people don't really discuss too much, but it can make a huge difference to how you control your palette. So we all know that red and yellow make orange. But which red and which yellow make the cleanest orange? And what happens when you put colours that lean in different directions against one another? So to prove this point, you can already see this mix isn't super clean. It's still got the golden undertone, but it's not super bright. We're working with a green based yellow. We're playing that against a pink or a purpley based red. So the way my palette's laid out is we're sort of working through the colour biases of these colours. If we put these two together, we're going to end up with a very vibrant clean orange. These two separate a little bit. So there's a little bit of murk in that colour, and we want to utilize that. I'm going to ramp that up a little bit more. While you're watching, if you think that anyone that you know may be interested in this as well, please feel free to share it. I would appreciate that. So, just giving my brush a quick wipe out, we're going to get there and wet our sand area now. Now, if you have a really good look, you're going to see a lot of the sand is coming down through the cliffs here. I'm being very careful not to touch my sky area. I don't want too much bleed here. Just going to dab that top section out a little bit. And we're going to flood the sand area. Another alternative you might like to use, and we will use that in a second, is obviously we could bring in a touch of that burnt sienna if we really wanted to get that warm brown undertone to it. But for the moment we're going to keep things basic. So taking this mix, we're just going to rush the brush backwards and forwards through the space. Couple of gentle little drag downs over the top of the trees. You can use the paper towel to dab back if you need to. Once I've got that basic colour in there, we're going to just take a touch of the burnt sienna into that. Now, when you're introducing new colour in against wet paint, you need to make sure you're increasing the amount of pigment that goes into your mix. So what that means is you don't want to thin down whatever you're putting across the base mix more than the base mix actually was. There has to be more physical paint in there. It's really, really crucial. Otherwise, it will run and become quite ugly. So we're just going to take this burnt sienna. This is still going to run a little bit, but it's going to be controlled. This is just going to get a little bit more warmth through the colour. Just to get some interest through the sand. So one thing that watercolour does really, really well, which most mediums struggle with, is very soft graduations and colours bleeding into one another. So this is where you want to take advantage of that and work to its strengths. So when we look here, you can see that I've sort of created a boundary here for where we can see the shadow colour coming into the sand. For that shadow colour, this mix that we've got has already got a starting point for us. I'm actually going to just take a little bit of ultramarine, tiny bit more of the crimson, and a flick out of that sandy mix, and this will become our shadow colour. I've already got that little bit of the original sand colour sitting underneath, so I can drag this in. You'll notice I've got some posts in the scene here in the foreground just to keep things interesting. So this is just the crimson, the ultramarine, and a tiny bit of my original sand colour. And this is going to work to create our shadows. That shadow colour could actually be used through quite a bit here as well. So I'm actually going to work some of that in through my foliage. We'll increase the pigment mix here. So more of the ultramarine, more of the crimson, and I can just take that sand colour and work it in now. At this point, I'm only really looking to introduce this into my shadow areas. As I add the lemon yellow, it starts turning green. So you can see, big brush, we're getting some really good bold strokes in here. I'm barely touching the paper here. This is really important. When it comes to your mark making, lay the brush flat if you want to keep the paint actually moving into the surface. Where you want to create more interest in your mark making, take the pressure off. This is a really handy tip anytime you're trying to blend colours. Less pressure on your brush will create more controlled marks in terms of colours working together rather than fighting you. This is also a dry part of the paper, so what's happening is the paint's just catching on the dry paper as opposed to blending into the wet paper. I'm going to lift up the blue here. There's a lot of blue through these shadows. Once I get this part in, we will be switching across to our acrylic. So if you are hanging out for the acrylic component, not too much longer now. And if you're working along with the tutorial here, I'd love to see what you do at the end of the session. Make sure that you send it across to me. Feedback is always welcome. So if you have questions, remember, I am here to answer them. Alright, so we're going to leave our watercolour scene at that. Getting a good base, we've got a nice vibrant sky there. The sand is coming through quite cleanly, and we've got those nice shadows pulling off from the hills and the dunes. Just give me 1 second. We're going to switch across to our other camera and get stuck in. Alright, so with acrylic, we'll just quickly talk about the palette again. Lemon yellow, cadmium yellow deep, cadmium red. This time around we use magenta. Magenta leans toward what printmakers use. So when you're dealing with commercial printing, essentially it is all done using lemon yellow, magenta, phthalo blue, and black. We're taking black out of the equation. If you feel that you need to use it, don't be afraid of it, but make sure you've got colour in there. I don't generally bring it into my palette anymore. If I'm working on a really dark scene, I might introduce it just for some little accents, but most of the time it's kept out of play. So, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow deep, cadmium red, magenta, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, and titanium white. With these colours I can pretty much do everything. Certain pigments will have more strength than others. So when it comes to phthalo blue, if you're using it for the first time, be careful. It's what we class as a bully pigment. It will overpower anything that you use it in if you start with that colour. Brush wise, big bristle brushes are the go. Mine are very rough and ready, as you can see. They don't have to be expensive brushes to do a good job. They really don't. I actually prefer brushes that are rougher and have a bit of grit and gunk in them to get the best out of what I do with my work. We're going to start the same way as what we did on the other piece. This time around though, we're going to actually use the titanium white to get us going. So I'm just loading the brush up. You've got it semi-thin. Don't try and use the paint neat, you don't need to. The whole point is the paint needs to flow off the brush, and if you get to the point where you're struggling to get the paint to flow, you need to thin it down a little bit. This is the same if you are working in acrylic or oil. Paint consistency is something that you need to focus on because it's going to make your life difficult if the paint isn't working for you, and it's also going to make it a less pleasant experience for you. You want the paint to move with your brush and make life easier. I'm just dropping this white in. You might notice I'm doing an upward swoop here. I do this on purpose because it helps create a bit of movement and motion through my sky. Brushwork is about rhythm. It's not about keeping everything uniform. It's about trying to create underlying marks that the colours are going to work to. So anytime I'm dealing at the horizon, we're keeping the mark fairly flat. As we move up, I like to just open the scene up. You'll find that the water does the same thing. The water's doing this. The sand is doing this. The bushes are moving in different directions. Directional marks are your friend, so don't be afraid of them. Don't feel that everything has to sit in one direction, because it doesn't. Now, with this sky, we're going to come in the same as what we did previously. I'm just taking a mix of my phthalo and my ultra. You don't need a lot of paint for this, so I've just literally just taken a brush load out of both colours. And we're going to start from the top and just sweep across the canvas into that white paint that we've already put down. This allows for the softness of the colour to come through straight away as we're tinting at the moment we hit the canvas. And you can play with this. Don't be afraid to introduce other colours if you feel that they need to be in there. For the sake of this exercise, I am keeping things very simple, but you can take this as far as you want. As we move lower, you'll notice I'm really softening my brush mark here. So this comes back to what we were talking about before in terms of blending. Definite marks, strong pressure. Soft marks, no pressure. That little bit of blue can be worked under the surface. I'm just going to grab some more white to knock that down. So notice how we're getting that movement and sweep through the sky here. Just keeps things interesting. Down at the horizon, just very gently working across. Now the big difference between acrylic and watercolour, although they are both water-based mediums, acrylic is more about opaque paint. Watercolour is all about the translucency of that colour and the paper shining through it. So for things like clouds, we can drag those in and actually build them a lot more solidly through this. Into this mix, we're just going to take a little flick of our magenta. Just work it off to the side. We're looking for a slight mauve here. Could use it a little bit more. We want that purple undertone coming through in it. This, I'm just going to place some soft cloud forms off in the distance, just scrubbing them in. I'm accentuating the colour here so that you can see how to approach this. So clouds just need to be marks. Don't try and overcomplicate. Don't try and make them big shapes that are really obvious. Coming down to a smaller round brush now. I'm just going to pick up the tiniest amount of titanium with some lemon yellow. I'm going to work that into the corner of my mauve mix here. This is going to settle the cloud forms in, giving us a bit of a warmer grey. Again, little pressure on the brush. I'm not trying to create definite marks. I want this to be quite soft. Just giving the brush a quick wipe out. And we'll just come back in with a tiny bit more of the titanium white now. Still putting just a touch of the lemon yellow into that. And the reason for that is white normally gets sucked down by blue very quickly. So introducing that tiny variant of colour allows for us to work over this surface a little bit easier. Looking to get some warmth in these clouds, even though they are far away. Now we know the sun's coming from behind us here. So for that reason, we're making sure that the shadows of the clouds are sitting on the lower edge at the left-hand side of our canvas. As we move toward the edges, we don't need to put a huge amount in there. That gives me enough detail to control what's going on. Just going to get there and wipe out my big brush. And we're going to start with acrylic. We can treat this a bit differently, so we're actually going to start on the water next. With the water, phthalo blue is the colour. Alright, this is our starting point. Keep it reasonably transparent this time around. We're not trying to create a super strong coverage. I actually want to utilise some canvas texture here. Okay, so with the sky, it was all about getting a really deep coverage on that nice controlled area where the paint's really covering the white of the canvas. With the water, we're actually going to use just a tiny bit of a transparent pass just to get us going. It allows for more interesting mark making and a bit of contrast between the areas too. So with my water, all I'm doing, I'm taking my mix. Just show the palette while I'm doing this. I'm taking my mix and I have my phthalo blue, tiny touch of the lemon yellow in there, and we'll bring in just a little bit of the magenta. This will work along our horizon at the back edge first. Don't worry too much about straight horizons at the moment. You can go back and tidy up if you need to. Alright, once I've got that in, then I start working it down toward my sand. Barely touching the canvas, but really letting that thin paint just sit there. As we come closer in toward the shoreline, the lemon yellow starts to take over a little bit. But when I've introduced that, I'm coming across now. I'm not dragging it down. I'm now looking at underneath the surface a little bit. To me, painting water is all about rhythm and line, which is why I treat it in a different manner to my sky. I want to see the marks. I want to keep them quite soft, but I want to see those marks impacting on what's going on here. For the acrylic piece at the moment, we're just going to focus on getting our big block ins, looking at these big directional areas first. Then we can fine tune once it's had a bit of time to dry. So that sets up our water for the minute. There is a lot of phthalo blue at the back, and then we just get this slight sort of lemony yellow kicking through, creating a bit of a turquoise as we move toward the rock banks. For our sand, we're actually going to go in a bit differently this time. So I'm taking some cad yellow deep. I'm bringing that straight in against my titanium white. Okay, so we get this really rich straw yellow happening first. That titanium white's also got just the touch of blue from when I've been doing the clouds in the sky. Then introducing the magenta. The magenta or the crimson in sand is so crucial because everyone looks at it and thinks it's really, really yellow, but there's more pink hiding in there than what a lot of people tend to register when they look at it. Because we all have a habit of painting or seeing what our brain is telling us as opposed to what is physically in front of us. So that pink coming through the colour is really, really crucial here. You'll remember that we used a similar variation when we did our watercolour piece. But with this, I'm just going to push it in a different direction. So using that cad yellow deep, we end up with a bit more richness to the colour, a bit more dirtiness in that colour. And I'm doing that because we're not working translucently here. I wanted to get a completely different feel between the two pieces. So just taking that, I'm going to scrub that in to the areas that we know that the sand is going to be. to try and paint clean lines at the moment. We don't need them. Okay, so that gets us a really good start. From there, then we can start introducing some cleaner colour into there. So I'm just going to take the palette, and off on one side we are going to make a more golden mix. Through some of our foreground area, that can be used just as rough broken marks here. I want to lighten that off a bit more. I'm looking for contrast against our base colour. So if you can see a good separation point on the palette, that will generally translate when you put it onto the canvas. One thing that is really crucial to keep in mind when you're painting is the colour, believe it or not, is not the most important part. It is how light or dark that colour is that you should be focusing on first. A lot of the time when people get started in colour, it's one of the things that trips them up. Because when you're working in pencil, which is generally where we all start, we're focusing on how light or dark an area is in that drawing. It's not necessarily about, oh, what's that colour? It's all about just breaking it down to much more simple transitions. Taking that same approach with your painting will make life so much easier for you. While I've got this colour on the go, I'm just going to rough in some touches against our cliffs here. Notice the downward directional marks. So with the sand, we've got this with up here, we're breaking down, following the way that the light's coming down across the hill, across those dunes. Just giving the brush another wipe out. We're now going to start roughing in some of our foliage in the foreground here. Now many of you are probably looking at that and going, how are we going to do that? We haven't got black. I will show you, and you'll find in time this colour mix that I'm about to run you through will become one of your most useful. It's one that I've taught people who have been painting for 20 and 30 years, and a lot of them didn't know this when I first showed them. So, we all know that red and blue make purple, don't we? But do they? Take your phthalo blue. Take your cadmium red and mix them together. What you will find, I'm going to bring the palette over a little bit closer so you can see. What you will find is they don't necessarily make what you think they should. They're going to go much, much darker. They go dirty, you get a brown undertone to it. If you put more red in the mix, you're going to end up with a very red, rich, dark. If you put more blue in the mix, you're going to end up with a blue-based dark. But this is the ultimate dark mix for starting out, keeping things really simple on your palette. With this, I'm just going to work it pretty much into a middle range, and I'm looking at the shadows in the foliage. So back with that dry brushing that we were just doing before in the watercolour. If you want to make it slightly green, you can introduce just the touch of the lemon yellow in there. At the moment, I'm just going to concentrate on getting my dark patterns in. Remember, just like the watercolor piece, this is about dry brush marks. It's about texture. The difference between this and the watercolor is with the watercolor we can't really play as much over the top of what we put in to start off with, so you need to be a little bit more careful in the other medium. If I put a tiny bit more red and yellow into this, I'm going to end up with a brown. Now that brown is going to work in underneath some of our foliage in the foreground here. And if I keep adding the lemon yellow to that, we're going to get more green undertones, so nice rich dark greens that can be used very handily through some of these shadow areas. Just giving the brush another wipe out. Anytime you're going to work a different colour, try and just keep it clean. Try and avoid contaminating your brush too much. So for the shadow in the sand here, we're going to take some ultramarine, a little bit of the magenta, and a touch of our lemon yellow. Into that we can just work a tiny bit of the white so that we don't end up super clean, and then just balance that back up with the amount of blue that you can see in there. The whole point is we're looking for that richer shadow color, but we've just dropped in all of this wonderful dark, so it doesn't have to be super strong. I'm actually going to thin that down a little bit. So I've just knocked this down, greying it down using the same sand colour we already had on the go. And what we will do once that is all set, we should be able to do a bit now. I'm just going to pick up a little bit of the pinky range of our sand here and just introduce some softer marks in the body of the shadow, just in that foreground section, just to keep things a little bit more interesting. You can feel that cool shadow dropping straight in now, straight away. Alright, let me just check our paper over here. Yeah, the watercolour is pretty much good to go now. So, give me a second, we'll flip the cameras back over and get stuck back in. Alright, so at this point our watercolour paper is starting to dry out nicely, ready for our next layer to start working over. You can sort of see the similarities and the contrast between what we've just done in the acrylic compared to the watercolour piece. The watercolour really is a lot more about planning out prior to doing your work, whereas the acrylic is a little bit more forgiving. You can really just rip into it and have some fun. But when treated the right way, you can approach both of them without feeling too fearful of either medium. Just wipe the excess off my palette here. Now watercolour always dries lighter. You can start to see that straight away here. We've got much lighter variations in the sand than what we did. A lot of the darks that were dropped in here are now starting to just settle down. You can see those colours starting to illuminate a little bit. We don't need to go super dark on this. Some dark accents will work well, but we don't have to go crazy on it. Where we're focusing on this time around is going to be with our water. I'm grabbing my number 10 brush here. Now the water's a little bit dirty, but I'll actually use that to my advantage because it will help just to get some warmth through our water area. So all I'm doing, I'm going to pre-wet the space where I want the water. What you need to do with this, if you are going to be bringing the waves in, you actually need to leave the paper where the waves need to go alone. This takes a little bit to get used to. For the water, we're just going to grab the tiniest amount of our phthalo blue. And we're going to start dropping it into the space. That horizon I'll clean up later. Along the very edge, just like we used the crimson earlier, we're just going to take a tiny bit of our, or how we used the magenta earlier, we're just going to use a tiny bit of the crimson along that boundary line, just to dirty the mix a touch. This can also be used just to accentuate a couple of points. So the focus between these two pieces is going to be different. The approach is different as well, so they're never going to have the same feel. I will introduce just that little bit of lemon yellow to the turquoise here. So that we can start to lift up some of the foreground stuff. Let's run some little lines in our background area there too. Now, if you want, you can get there and scratch into this. Just be really careful doing it. Fingernail works well, but my fingernails are all cut at the moment, so they're not going to do the job. This bluey green colour that I've got on the go here is actually going to work quite nicely as an accent over some of our foreground stuff as well. So I'm going to just keep lifting this up a little bit more. We're going to take just a touch of the burnt sienna to it. and start flicking some little bushes into our foreground here. Again, we're not pre-wetting this area, so it's really crucial that we tackle these spaces in different approaches. I want to leave these little touches here. They work really, really nicely, and they're going to help to lift the light up in the scene. Down the bottom section here, I'm just going to take that mix, a little bit more burnt sienna, a little bit more lemon yellow, really getting that golden undertone to the colour, and this is just going to rough in some of the grasses around the posts down in the foreground. That same mix can be used very thinly to suggest some of the greenery on the cliffs. Don't try and make it all about even lines. Little broken marks do your work here. We can also just bring in the tiniest touch of crimson to that mix to dirty it. And you'll see it's just going to float in and separate it. Making it just that little bit more interesting. The mix with the crimson in can be used down in my foreground area here just to start positioning those posts that we could see. These aren't crucial, they're just a good little lead-in point to drag the eye into the scene. And I try and make them a little bit haphazard. I don't want them all looking the same. Increase the amount of crimson in this lot. That little dark mix that I taught you over on the acrylic works really well here too. So if you want to go dark, just take some phthalo, take some of your cadmium red. And you can use that if you really need to get some stronger darks in here. I'm going to just introduce some little touches. Dry brushing this in is really crucial. I don't want to get everything super harsh. I want to let the paper texture here work for me. Going to increase the amount of red here and start bringing in just the murk off the palette from the greens. Just makes it a bit more interesting. You get a bit more life popping through the shadows. And because this is a stronger mix, I can bring that in against the posts here to help accentuate those shadow points. It's going to take a little bit of the red variation of this mix, very thinly. Just throw it in across some of the top areas here. I'm going to blot some of the stuff against where I want my light outer touch. And we're going to introduce a tiny bit of the burnt sienna to the same mix. So the stronger we make this, the lighter your beach becomes. You don't have to push it too far. I honestly wouldn't go any further than what I've gone here. We're getting some good texture. We're getting a bit of a suggestion as to what's happening. These darker mixes can actually be used to start creating little bits of detail on the beach. Now, I will not have to go to my liner brush on this. I can pretty much do the majority of the work using this little one. But if you feel more comfortable going small, go small. You'll find over time you become more comfortable the more you work it. But I know to start off with it is a challenge. So I'm just taking a little bit of a burnt sienna and lemon yellow mix, just to throw some more marks through here. Too much. Just taking that bit of paper towel, I want to knock some of them down. I'll end up bringing a couple of figures in where I've just had that little bleed, where a touch of the blue's coming out. As I was saying earlier, phthalo blue is very powerful, so it is a staining pigment. You've got to be quite careful with it. Now we're going to work over into the rock shelves. For the rock shelves, I'm keeping things very simple. This is just going to be some burnt sienna and lemon yellow. Bring a touch of the dark in if you need. I'm starting with the edges of those rocks. These little broken marks can suggest so much, so don't try and paint the entire area. Let parts of it show. Bring a tiny bit more of the yellow into that mix now, just to dirty it up. And through this space, we're just going to rough the brush across the surface. That same colour that was just used over there can be used through the cliffs, just to lift up little touches as you need to. And that pretty much concludes our watercolour component here. If you were wanting to let this dry, you could go back through and give the water another pass over, get a bit more intensity in there. You can layer your colour, just don't overdo it. No more than 2 or 3 layers should be used. Once that's in, you'll find everything will balance quite nicely. You want to let the marks really work here and suggest a lot of what's going on rather than having full-on detail in every point. So let's move back across to our acrylic. So at this point the acrylics had plenty of time to dry. Most paint with acrylic is pretty much going to dry between 15 and 20 minutes. Although being colder today, it will take a little bit longer, but it's not going too badly at this stage. The majority of the paint mixes on the palette at this point are going to be semi-dry. So we're just going to come back in and start working a little bit of the colour for the rock shelves. For that, grab your magenta, grab your lemon yellow, and you end up with this nice, vibrant, reddy orange. As I said, this is printmakers. This is how they make colour for magazines and everything else. So having a rough idea as to how this works is a really, really handy thing to do. We're going to take a touch of the ultramarine blue into that. Just want to dirty it off ever so slightly. And we're going to start roughing in the position of some rock shelves. I can treat this in many different ways. I'm just going to come through and rough this in very thinly to start off with, and then build the thicker paint on top of it. I need a little bit more white on my palette. Glad you're enjoying it, Lorena. So when I put the white in here, it's really chalking this up and greying the colour a little bit. That's because of the fact I'm working with 3 primaries plus white now. All I'm going to do to lift that back up is bring a tiny bit of the cadmium yellow deep now in. This is going to be my body colour that sits over the top of the rock shelves I've just put in. It's essentially mixing up a variation on a yellow ochre or a raw sienna. Obviously, those colours are very easily obtainable. I like just to get there and make sure that my students can mix that sort of colour without constantly having to just have the tube on hand. Gives you a bit more freedom. So roughing in these large areas to take some white. Now the white is just going to come in against the rock shelves, especially in the background, and just catch edges. Remember, this is an impression. We're not trying to create a photorealistic piece here. We're trying to capture the feeling of what we see in the scene. In this area that I've just brought in, I'm actually going to tint that with a little bit of the blue. This is just going to be some of the sky reflecting down against the very shallow water here. Wanting this just to have the slightest touch of blue coming through. Now if I take that same colour I've just used there, I can actually start to work in over here through my bushes. Just makes a bit of a neutral, gives me a light to play off there, and then I can start pushing the more green undertones back in as I need them. I'm going to bring a lot more blue into that. Just wiping the brush out again so I can get some thinner colour to work over the top of this as well. So this mix is just working with the dark mix again, tiny bit of white in there and a little bit more of the magenta just to get a bit of interest. And again, we can just use this to work some soft shadows in against these lighter areas. Be expressive, be bold with these marks, have some fun. Above all else, have fun with what you're doing. Because I'm telling you now that it may seem strange, but if you're not enjoying the process, if you're not being excited about what you're doing, then it's going to show on the canvas. Breakthroughs from my students always happen when they let loose, when they really just rip into it and have some fun with it. And they're not stressing about what's going on. They're just going, you know what? This is the learning experience. Let's just let go and whatever happens, happens. The moment they do that, it is a game changer. It really is. Just going to bring some more dark back through here. Remember, if you're enjoying the demonstration in class, feel free to share it around. If you know someone else that might be interested in having a go as well, I'll be keeping this up both here on Facebook, and it'll be loaded up to YouTube later today. So you can always refer back to it. I'm purposely trying to go at a pace that people should be able to handle, but if you can't, do not stress. It's not the end of the world. As long as you get something out of the process, I will be happy. Just coming through with a bit of a dirty green mix here. So this is just working with a lot of what we've got here. A tiny bit more white and some more lemon yellow. Just hitting some of the greenery on these dunes here. And as much as I'm playing through this area, I'm still getting that contrast between the cliff and the shadow falling down from there. Just going to get a little bit more sand colour happening now. This is back with the cad yellow, deep, some magenta and some white. And we're just going to lighten up some of our sand spaces. Things are starting to dry now, so I can start to pull in the next layer of colour over this. We're going to start with some water. So for this, I'm just reflecting just through the shallows again. I just want to reflect a tiny touch of the blue back down. I'm coming in with a thinner brush this time. Thinner brush but thicker paint. Very white. I'm just letting the brush catch the canvas. Against the ledge of the rock shelf back here, I'm doing the same thing. And right at the horizon, I just want to make this all sort of blend a little bit. I don't want it to be super sharp. I don't want it to be super defined. I just want to have these colours sort of melding into one another. I'm going to get a little bit of wave happening here. Now, for your white, actually get there and put a little bit of your sand mix into the white for the white caps on your waves. Doesn't need much, but that tiny bit of warmth is going to help separate and lift your waveforms forward so that they don't become overpowered by the blues and the greens. It's a really good underpainting trick. Titanium white by its own properties is very cool. While it's white, it does have a slight blue, sort of cooler bias to it. So what you want to do, you just want to push that in the other direction a little bit. So I just like to bring a drop of red or a drop of orange into that mix, and it just helps separate it. Come on, just waiting for my camera to focus again. My apologies about that, I didn't realise that the autofocus wasn't set. Come on, when you're ready. Just give me a second. That's better. Apologies about that. Most of the time the cameras hold up pretty well, but every now and again they lose their setting and lose what they're doing. And sometimes I'm too focused on my screen, or on my canvas, sorry, to see that they're not doing what they're meant to be doing for you. Next up, I'm just going to paint in my posts in the foreground. I'm coming in with a grade variation of the dark mix. So the phthalo blue, cadmium red, tiny touch of white, and I'm bringing a little bit of the cad yellow deep in here. I want the posts this time around to be quite rough and ready. While I've got that little bit of dark on the go, that can work quite nicely, just in against the rock shelves to break them up a little bit more. Once I've got that dark in, then we can throw a little bit of light in. The light I'm keeping really simple. I haven't cleaned the brush, so I've just got that same mix on the go. I'm putting more of the cadmium yellow in it and a lot more white. And then finally just grabbing some neat white. You can see how rough it is on the brush here. To really show that light striking the posts. That neat white can also be used just through the top of some of this foliage to lift it out a little bit more. I'm just going to grey our dunes off in the background using that same colour. Going to come through with another pass over my rock shelves. This is using the Cad Yellow Deep, a little bit of the Cad Red, and our dark mix. And it's more about texture here, just to get some variation and some light back into the scene through that point. And I'll rough some little touches into our sand here too. Some neat white will finish us off here, which is going to bring in some more little ripples through the water. And that pretty much sees the acrylic little demonstration here finished. You can see it's not necessarily about detail, it's about suggestion of those forms, looking at the big areas and just breaking them down into more abstract shapes. Obviously, this could be pushed for another hour if I really felt like it, or I could leave it at that stage and go, it gets the feel of the scene where it needs to be. Now, we do still have that little blob down here on our watercolor piece, so let's finish this one off. We're just going to bring a figure walking along the beach here, so I'm just picking up that rich dark that we started with earlier, coming in with my liner, and we're going to put a couple of people down on the beach here. Just a couple wandering right back up along the distance there. Now with the brush just wiped out a touch, we're just going to grab the base of each of those figures and drag out some shadows. Final thing to do is going to be just glazing. So glazing is putting transparent paint over an area. I'm just going to take a little bit more of our phthalo blue here. Bring a touch more of the lemon yellow into it. And we're just going to lift the depth of the water up a touch. Alright, that sees us done for our free class painting a scene in both acrylic and watercolor. Really hope you enjoyed it. Please send me through what you achieved out of the demo. I'd really like to see. If you would like more information on my classes, I do have spaces in my Wednesday night online classes, and we'll be getting some new beginners art classes running on Sundays at the same time as this. So if you want to join us, please shoot me a message or send me an email at leirustartstudio@gmail.com, and I'll be more than happy to send the info across. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you again soon.